Good evening. This is Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and we're live and online on Valley Beth Shalom Live on Facebook. And this evening in the Rabbi Study, it's my privilege to welcome Barbara Artson. Barbara is a dear friend who has just published a wonderful book. The book is called Odessa, Odessa, and we'll be speaking to Barbara about her new book. Good evening, Barbara. Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure, Rabbi Ed. I want to thank you so much for inviting me. And I want to give a shout out to my wonderful publisher, She Writes Press. Couldn't have a better support than the group of women who publish in that group. So, yeah, it's really wonderful to be here.
Wonderful. So why don't you allow us this, instead of my reading a biography, tell us your story. Tell us where you come from and how you came to be an author, and tell us how this book came to be, please.
Well, it goes back, oh my heavens, a long time. How about 40 years, 45 years ago? And I was in graduate school in English literature. And it was in my final semester. I was on my way to a PhD, and something came up in my personal life, and I had to switch roles, switch tracks. And in the last seminar that I was attending, I was supposed to write a paper, an essay on the narrative voice of Jane Austen, and I was really tired of doing things like that. And I asked the professor if I could finish The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which was Dickens' last novel, and he died halfway through it. And so he said, "Oh, okay, go ahead, do it." And I did. And I had a marvelous experience. I had what I called a magical writing experience. I put down all the things that needed to, because it was a mystery, all the things that need to be resolved. And then I sat down. It was a typewriter, an electric typewriter at the time. And I started writing, but it wrote itself. I did not, I was writing and I was surprised, I was shocked, I was crying. I didn't know what had happened. I don't know if you've had any experience like that in writing your books. Anyway, I always looked at literature from the vantage point of psychoanalysis. And so it seemed like a very easy switch for me to apply to graduate school in psychology, which I did. But I promised myself at that time that I was going to write a novel. And many years later, training in psychoanalysis, I had a clinical practice. I decided at turning 70, well, that I was going to either write this now or I wasn't going to write. And so I did the same thing. I sat down. By this time, it was a computer, and I didn't know what I was going to write. And I put my fingers on the keyboard and I wrote, "Henya Hana is a woman who no longer bleeds. So she puzzles over how this could have happened. Try as she might, she can't remember the last time she and Mendel were together. We must have been, she thinks. Otherwise, how could this be?" She smiles, thinking of how he touched her when they were younger. But now? And then I knew that I was going to write something about my mother's family history. And it is a very loose history of my mother's experience. It is mostly my imagination. In Thomas Mann, when he was writing Joseph and His Brothers, he talked about clothing the myth. And and I don't put myself in his category, but this is what I did. I took the very basic structure of my mother's family and put clothes on it. Because she was an immigrant. She came here in 1905. She was 10 years old. There were 6 brothers and sisters. The first batch left the Pale of Settlement in Pogorny, Odessa. And she came with the second wave. She was with her mother and the 3 younger children. So that was true. And she also, when she came here, she got a job. Well, she went to school. She didn't have a lot of schooling. She then got a job with her older sister's husband in a bloomer factory. That part is also true. And she did sew elastic to the waistbands of bloomers. So the first part in Odessa, and with a pogrom that starts, made up. As you know, most immigrants don't want to talk, well, especially Jewish immigrants, I imagine. I don't know if it pertains to others. I knew nothing of her background, nothing. And when I would ask her about it, she would, no, why would I talk about that? And so in a sense, this was my way of knowing my mother better, of trying to understand her personality. Because in ways, I realize now after, how many years of clinical experience, she was traumatized. She was a woman who was afraid to do a lot of things. And yet, and here's the resilience. She was dancy, she was singy, I'd come home from school and she'd put on a record and we'd sing together and we'd dance together. She just was afraid of outside life, but she spoke without an accent. She made sure she was gonna, and she would look around and she would see what other people were doing. And she would emulate them. So maybe I'm going on too long about that, but that's how I came to, I wanted to understand my mother better. I don't know that I knew that consciously, but that's what I tried to do. I sat down and that's what I learned about her. I learned in writing this book, not in my 5-year analysis. I learned in writing this book who my mother was, and that I was standing on her shoulders. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So what makes this book so engaging is what you said, is you've given us some very deep portraits of some of the members of your family, or at least the myth or the story of the family. And I think that's terribly valuable, because what we have, so many families have, are just black and white pictures or seriatone pictures of people, and they're 2-dimensional. And we don't have the sort of depth of character that you bring to each of the generations of the family. It's a 4-generation or 5-generation family coming from Odessa, coming from Russia, the immigration experience, or the terrors of living in the ghetto, in the Pale of Settlement, and then the immigration experience here. And then the development of the family as they become Americans. And then there's a sort of postscript at the end. If I can give away the book, there's a postscript to the book about what happens to one particular family member who sort of is induced at the beginning and comes back at the end. So the story begins with an accidental birth, as it were, and it ends with the discovery of a family, a whole side of the family that the characters kind of come to discover. And it's a remarkable journey inside these characters, as well as their own adventures. And one of the things that I think also makes it so engaging, besides the fact that you do give us the interiority of these characters, is that it focuses principally on women. It's at least the principal focus is on the women of the family. And too often when the story of immigration, and especially when Jewish immigration is told, it's the men's story. it's what Papa did and it's what Uncle so-and-so did. But here, the women become the carriers of the story because they become the carriers of the family. They become the carriers of the family. And part of that is a story of powerlessness and power, of what happens to characters when they experience powerlessness and what begins to happen to them when they experience power. And both power and powerlessness has a certain amount of corruption associated with it. So
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about why you chose to tell the story through the women, and the question of the power, the resilience of these characters, and how it is that they find their way in the world.
Well, Henya, who is the rabbi's wife, the book as you've just laid it out absolutely beautifully. I wish I could have written that down. It starts in the shtetl, and she is the wife of a rabbi, and she does what the wife of a rabbi is supposed to do, and she believes that what she does is very, very important, and she hasn't got the education. So when the time comes for her to leave, and her husband and her older boys and one daughter has left earlier, she's left with the responsibility of doing everything that she had to do to get the family to on the boat and into Ellis Island. When I started, I don't think I started writing necessarily from the vantage point of women. I mean, the story is about a, a brother, a younger brother, who takes the rabbinic mantle from his older brother because the older brother does not want religion. He doesn't believe in religion. He believes in socialist and the Bund movement. And by the way, that's all imagination. That is not, there is no, that whole third section of the book in Palestine, Israel, is fiction. And the character of the older brother who leaves the family is also fiction. It's totally made up. And coming over on the boat, the character of Bessie, who befriends Henya, is also a fictional character. But as you've picked up something very important that many people have not picked up. Many people, and it's described, I think, in my book, and some of the reviews and stuff, they talk about it as a novel about two men. One goes one way and one goes the other way. And to me, the heroes of the book are Henya. Someone asked me who was my favorite character. And I said, when I was writing Henya, I loved her. I loved her. She was my favorite character. And then when I was writing the second generation, the daughters of, well, it would be the second generation. I get confused, but the Dora character I loved, and that would be my mother. That was my favorite character. And then as I progressed, I don't know about the two sisters, if I could say that they were favorites of mine. They just moved the storyline ahead from my perspective, even though Roberta was the one that was kind of representing me. But when I got to the final and I wrote the journal for Shmuel, was it Shmuel? Yeah, for Samuel, he has different names. So he starts as Samson and he moves into Samuel, and he starts as Shimshon, Samson, and he moves and he ends up as Samuel Kitar because he takes on an Israeli name. I loved him. And when I wrote that journal, I don't think that I wrote a page without, and see, I'm moved now, without tears, that I had no experience like his. It was not at all like that, but who he was. And see, it's not just women. He was such a hero. He stood up for what he believed in. And he was someone who could admit his flaws. And he had many. But then all of my characters, the fact that Henya could do what she did, the fact that Dora could do what she did, that she could be moved from the ghetto in Brighton Beach and be moved to a Christian working class community as the only Jew and struggled to fit in. They all had their resilience and their bravery and achievements. So did I answer your question?
Well enough. It's fine. I find it interesting that you fell in love with that last character. You're the therapy, you're the shrink. So you can explain to me, I guess this is if this were Jung, it would be your archetype. And you paint an archetype Jew who is very different than what we normally associate as the mythical icon of the Eastern European Jew. First of all, his name is Shimshon, who is Samson, who is big and tough, and he fights. I mean, literally fights. He goes to war with the Cossacks, and then is haunted by the nightmares because he still has a soul. And as you painted the character, comes to Israel and tries to make his peace with the different parts of his own character, which in so many ways captures, I think, the contemporary situation of Israel and in many ways American Jewry as well. So I think you have to promise us another novel where you take that journal and make that into a whole novel, because what you've captured in that character is something very deep inside of us.
It was very, I would have a hard time explaining how that came out of me, because it's like no one I know, but he does represent certain ideas that I hold. It's not that I don't know what or couldn't identify with some of his thoughts, but he was much more brave. He could stand up for himself in ways, for example, that I couldn't as a child in a working class Jewish community. As the only blonde in my family and blue eyes, as the only Jew in the block, with a lot of anti-Semitism there. But, okay, something just hit me. Wow. My father stood up to people. My father was an atheist. And he never, but he was Jewish. He was Jewish. And if anybody ever said anything about Jews or whatever, my father would be right there standing up. So in a sense, isn't that interesting? I just got a sense of that, in a sense, Shimshon has aspects of my father. Oh. Can I read a part to you?
Most certainly.
Okay, I'd like to read the first part, and this answers the question of why people leave everything they know and love, their language, their home, their tradition, often their family who buried in graves. They leave not because it's a flight of some fancy, they just want to make money or do anything. They leave because they have to leave. So this is Henya and Mendel. She's given birth to this child, and she has her children. Some of them are around, and she's okay. I'll start. On Easter Sunday after supper, as Henya is bathing Merya in the tin tub, the Cossacks turn up without warning. The neighing of horses announces their arrival. In their bedroom, Mendel has wrapped himself in his talit in preparation for his nightly prayer. Henya stands petrified like a statue, barely breathing, so to translate the commotion coming from the streets. She hears the shouting of gruff male voices speaking Russian, the screams of women, the menace of barking dogs. She hears the blast of a musket. She hears doors being smashed. She commands her paralyzed body to move. She lifts Merya from the pan of hot soapy water and wraps her in a towel. She gives her a sugar stick to suck. Shah, Shah, be still, my little one. Mendel, Mendel, come quick. Oh, God Almighty, there's trouble. Bolt the door. She shouts orders like a general. Mendel obeys and then pushes the couch in front of the door. When she hears the shrieks coming closer, she hollers, get Disha and Lieb out of bed, hide them under the floorboards. Where is Fagel? Gott and you. Another pogrom. The thump of heavy booted footsteps, the cries of terror, the thunder of horses' hoofs close in. She shushes Merya despite her silence. We're going to play a little game, Mama. Mama is going to play peekaboo, and you must be very, very quiet. Quiet, mein Kinder, she gestures, putting her finger to her mouth. Outside, the Cossacks drunkenly shatter windows and furniture and send kerosene lamps with their scalding liquid airborne. They set dwellings on fire with the toss of a match. Turns into gray, powdery rubble in minutes. They drag men, mostly old and feeble, barefooted and in nightshirts out of their homes. They tug at the young men's beards and sidelocks. They snigger as they rip yarmulkes off the heads of their victims, who try in vain to cover their bare skulls with their hands. They fire their muskets in the air for fun. They laugh as old ladies cower in the corner of their dwellings. They throttle anyone bold enough to protect or protest, who dares to try to protect their families. With their knives, they butcher the few castaway dogs that wander in the neighborhood. They rape young girls and old women alike. They toss children to the ground and burn sidurs, all the while chanting their mantra, killed the goddamn kikes, killed the Yids, they killed our savior. Shmuel and Avram escaped detection by hiding in a potato bin. But the soldiers pummel Levi as he walks home from Cheder, head in the holy book. They heave Mendel to the floor and kick him in the ribs when he bars their way into his home. He holds them off long enough for Henya to hide sleeping Merya under a pile of dirty laundry, and then collapses to the floor in agony, holding his bruised ribs. He tries to retrieve the yarmulke that's fallen from his head. A Cossack steps on Mendel's wrist with his heavy boots. My God, why have you forsaken me? He moans. The screams and cries of terror, the stench of smoke and the burning of sacred prayer books, the river of blood, the barricaded doors and the windows caving in to the invaders' powerful fists and clubs bring confusion and dread to all but Merya. who sleeps peacefully in her little wicker basket, concealed beneath a pile of dirty laundry and still sucking her sugar stick. Henya knows now, without a doubt, that her baby girl is deaf. That's what came out of me without knowing what I was going to write.
Right, that's extraordinary. It's an extraordinarily vivid picture of the terror of that place and the strength. The only thing I would argue with you is that you love Shimshon at the end of the book because he's this fighter, but I think that you're underestimating the strength of say Henya, for example. I mean, the idea of surviving that, gathering three children, an infant and two small children, making the trek, and you describe how she gets the visa, and you hint at some of the things she needs to do to get the visa, the trek across the ocean, and the family's ability to find a place in America, and then your mother's place, Dora's ability to find a place in America.
Absolutely.
There's a different kind of fight in that, a different kind of resilience, a different kind of strength, which I think is equally admirable, but it's more subtle. And you do a wonderful job in sort of sketching that as well.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And I do think, as I said, my identification with each character as they kind of progressed, with Henya taking on the role that she had never been trained to take on. This was a woman who couldn't read.
Right.
And then she goes through all of the steps, the different things that they had to pass in order to get themselves into Ellis Island and beyond. And, knowing what my mother went through, and the way in which she had to learn about how people act in I was going to say that I haven't named the little community that I lived in this small working class community. It was just courageous, and that she could do that. And that is, of course, what I learned. There's a thing I wanted to mention something. As you know, there's a lot of Yiddish sprinkled throughout this book. In fact, there's a glossary at the end of all the Yiddish terms. Now, I don't speak Yiddish, and mostly I don't understand Yiddish. And my grandparents, who lived in Brighton Beach, didn't speak English ever. And they died when I was 8. I would go there every so often, and of course they would speak Yiddish, and I didn't know what they were saying. And I also had this fantasy when I was a little girl, and I would sometimes cry myself to sleep, that when you get to be old, you get to speak that language, and then I wouldn't be able to understand myself. I was just petrified with that. But so as I started writing this book, again, the only time my father did not speak Yiddish. The only time she would speak, he understood it, is when she didn't want us to know something. As I was writing the book, Yiddish, as I'm writing the language, the conversations, the narrative, words come pouring out of me. Again, on the page. I did not look these words up and say, I have to use these Yiddish words in here. They came out, and I'm writing them. I may not have known how to spell them, but I spelled them as best I could. And I was stunned. And what I then had to do was get a Yiddish dictionary, and I looked up the words as they would come out of my mouth. Many of them were absolutely right. They were on target, and a lot of them were distorted understandings that grew out of the child who was trying to make up what those words must have meant. So
you call that a collective unconscious, or do you call that your own unconscious grasp of the language, right?
I'm not a Jungian, I'm a Freudian.
Yeah, I understand that. I want to point to one aspect of this, which I think is necessary.
Mhm,
When we tell the story of our immigrant ancestors, we always polish it. Everyone's grandfather was a sainted rabbi. Everyone's grandmother was a saint. You, however, and you do show a great deal of reverence for your ancestors, but you show us
mhm,
dark sides of the immigrant experience, dark sides of the immigrant generation. There is an incidence of incest,
mhm,
and basically child rape in the book. There is a boyfriend who shows up and seduces one of the characters, as it were, or at least entices her, and then disappears. There's the crushing poverty of the ghetto in New York, the ghetto in New York, and then the vicious anti-Semitism of the community in New Jersey when the family finally makes enough money to go. But you show us a picture of the dark side of that experience, which very few other writers have taken on. So why did you decide to do that?
I'm a psychoanalyst. I know, I know the dark side of people and that people are not all bad and they're not all good and they all struggle with these aspects of themselves: jealousy, envy, greed, hate. Um, you know, and hate is the other side of love. I mean, we all, and of course, I know the components, the aspects of me that I don't like, where I can be, uh, I don't know about mean, but I've done my share of things that I'm not too proud of. But that's all part of being human, and it's how you deal with it and what you make of it, and whether you can confront it. And see, that's what I also liked about um, my made up character. That it's a Shimshon character, the one that ends up being Samuel. He did dastardly things, and he knew it, and he was plagued by it. In fact, he would go off the very deep end. And yet this was a character that I loved. And maybe, obviously we all didn't do the things that he did. But we all have to deal with those conflictual sides of ourself. We're not all good and we're not all bad. And I think that's in a sense the way we have to look at what's going on in the world today as well. I don't want to get into that though, but I think this book does reflect and does elucidate so much of what we're dealing with today. The immigrant experience, the people who are mistreated, abused, um, what's going on, how children. There's an incident in the book where Henya is um, on her way getting onto the ship, and they take her son from her because he's 14 years old, and they say men on this side and women on this side, and she says, no, 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 he's only a boy. You give him to me, give him to me. And they say, mach schnell, get on, get this way. And that's an incident of what it feels like to be separated from your children. What are we doing today? We're separating kids from their parents. And that's the character who goes on and abuses Dora because he also was traumatized. Who knows what that experience meant, the separation from his mother, the way that he was examined by the doctor, which was also traumatic for him. So
It's interesting. I read that differently. I got to tell you.
okay,
Um, I I um
good.
I actually thought no. I appreciate what you said, but I actually read those pieces as a sort of dark foreshadowing of what would have happened had they not left. The separation of men from women, the doctor's examination, the taking of the young boy away from his family were all the steps in Nazi deportation. And had Henya and Mendel not left Odessa, they would have become victims of the Nazis. And that's how I read. I was reading that you were saying to us, this is miserable, but what could have been a lot more miserable. And the story could have ended in a very different way had they not had the courage to pick up and leave to a very strange foreign land, despite its promises. So it occurs to me that that this week is in the American calendar is Erev Yontif. We're about to celebrate the 4th of July, and that part of what you've given us here is an American story, a story of a family that came from very difficult conditions with a tremendous dream, and what that dream did to many of the different parts of the family. And then at the same time, I love your character, Shimshon, and I'm going to ask you, I'm a teacher, as you know, and so I'm going to ask you to do some homework and write the next novel, which is Shimshon's story, and really try to develop the sort of bilateral nature of his character, the aggression on the one hand and the deep compassion and sensitivity on the other. And I'll need you to move to Israel for 20 years because you'll have to see how that finds its way into the Zionist narrative. So Barbara, before we finish, every interviewer like me asks an author a really silly question, but it's a question that I think an author should be prepared to at least help us. So it's a wonderful book. It's an engaging book. Let me show everyone the title. That's the book. It's called Odessa, Odessa, Barbara Artson. And the publisher is She Writes Press. When we finish the book, what would you most like the reader to come away with?
And before I answer that, I love the fact that you had your interpretation and your response. It's what is so wonderful about writing a book. You write the book, you have your own thoughts, you put it out there, and somebody takes it and articulates a wonderful theme that maybe I didn't think about. I mean, I loved what you just said. So what I would like my readers to come away with is a profound sense of what it is to be the object of discrimination. Not only religious discrimination, but in any group, whether it's because of race or religion or the color of one's skin or one's sexual identity, or whether you're disabled. All of the things that makes one an other. I would hope that having read this book would at least give a deeper, more profound understanding of what it is, what it means to be persecuted. And if people get that, then I will be happy.
Well, that's very wonderful. Thank you. We'd like to thank Barbara Artson, author of Odessa, Odessa. There's the book once again. It's a wonderful read about the story of a family's immigration from Russia to America and their immigration through 5 generations of remarkable personal and collective development. Thank you, Barbara, for joining us tonight. Thank you to all of you on the Zoom call, and thank you all for watching tonight. We want to wish you a very pleasant evening and a very happy and safe 4th of July. Have a very, very wonderful night tonight.
Thank you very much, Ed.